Hi, I'm Tamara.
And I'm Maria.
Today we'll be discussing the environmental and health impacts of weed.
To understand the impacts of weed, we first need to understand what weed is.
Weed is a term used to describe cannabis, which is a psychoactive drug produced by a cannabis plant. There are many ways to describe weed. You may have heard the terms marijuana, pot, bud, grass, and dope.
The plant contains more than 500 chemicals, including THC, also known as delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. This chemical creates the high feeling.
Many growers prefer the female cannabis plant.
How can you tell the difference between male and female?
The sex is shown by what grows between their nodes. The female cannabis plant produces buds or flowers that contain the THC chemicals. Male cannabis plants grow pollen sacs used to fertilize the female plant.
Cannabis plants can be monoecious or dioecious, as they can have both sexes in the same plant or plants with separate sexes.
However, most cannabis plants are dioecious, making female plants the most sought after.
Now, knowing what it is, it's important to know how it's grown.
The first step is to find a place to grow your weed. Weed requires proper lighting, which is step number 2, and may include metal halide and high-pressure sodium lights, and the other lighting options are fluorescent and LED grow lights.
Step number 3 is to have a steady airflow, which can be maintained through exhaust fans and filtered air inlet. Step 4, controls and monitoring, which includes having an adjustable thermostat, a 24-hour timer for lights, and a pH meter to check pH levels.
Step 5 is to decide on a grow medium, what you're growing it in. There are 2 options, soil or soilless. Step 6 is to determine the plant placement, depending on the medium used.
Step 7 is to feed the plant nutrients, including micro and macronutrients. Macronutrients include nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Micronutrients are required in smaller quantities, including calcium, magnesium, iron, and copper. The plant requires more fertilizer or nutrients than most common crops.
The final step is to water the plant. The amount of water depends on the medium used and the size of the plants. If overwatered or not given enough, the plant will surely die.
Now that we know what cannabis is and how it's grown, we will take a deeper look at how we are impacted by it.
As many of you may know, cannabis became legal in October of 2018, and interestingly enough, Canada has the second highest usage rates of cannabis in the world.
The Low Risk Use Guidelines, LRCUG, was developed in order to reduce the health consequences of cannabis use by identifying health risks and providing recommendations to limit the impacts.
We need to consider a lot of factors when identifying the impacts of cannabis. Factors such as how frequent it's being used, the amount, type of cannabis, whether it's organic or a higher potency level, and whether it's inhaled or consumed.
When inhaling cannabis, the smoke goes in through the lungs and into the bloodstream, whereas ingesting edibles goes through the digestive system and into the bloodstream.
There are 2 main methods of inhaling weed, through rolled forms such as joints, blunts, or spliffs, or devices with a carb, which are airways within a device that clear the chamber. Bowls, bongs, and pipes are such devices.
How one chooses to use cannabis can change the level of impact. Using bongs and water pipes increases the risk of inhaling toxic matter of those devices, which may result in the development of tuberculosis. The practice of dabbing is linked to increased risk of hydrocarbon burns and inhalation of rust.
The process of dabbing consists of a heated nail, water bong, and a substance, usually shatter, butter, oil, or resin. The nail and the bowl are heated. The substance used is then dipped into the heated bowl and burned into a vapor. You then inhale the smoke vapor from the substance. The substances used to dab usually have a higher doses of THC.
Edibles or liquid forms are relatively safer route as it doesn't involve the inhalation process. However, due to this perception that it is safer, individuals may see it as less of a threat and take more than they normally would.
Although it is a safer way of using, it does not reduce the impacts of weed itself on developmental and physical factors.
Edibles in liquid forms have a delayed effect of 30 minutes to 1 hour because they go through the digestive system. And although it has less THC in the bloodstream, the high lasts longer than per se smoking would.
Those who start using cannabis before the age of 18 are at bigger risk for developmental problems. This is because the human brain isn't fully developed until approximately 25 years of age.
Problems such as decreased attention span, memorization ability, and other executive functioning skills are impaired, like the ability to plan and organize.
Cannabis varies in level of THC, so the level of THC changes how impactful it is. For example, the intake of high-level THC cannabis is linked with memory issues as well as increased dependence.
Intake of cannabis may also cause symptoms of nausea and anxiety, and may result in psychosis.
Individuals also respond differently when using cannabis. For some, intake might increase anxiety symptoms, and for others it might help reduce. This also depends on the amount, potency level, and amount of experience. Frequent cannabis use increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases and changes in brain structure, and also has been linked with suicidality.
Researchers also have found a correlation between daily use and anxiety disorders, which confirms that frequency is related to increased risk of health impacts.
Cannabis use impacts the ability to focus, estimate speeds and distances, and reaction time.
All these functions are necessary when driving. This explains why motor vehicle accidents, also known as MVAs, are more likely to happen when the driver is high.
Now that we know how cannabis physically and mentally harms us, we can assume that these substances are released into the air through growing and smoking, that we are contributing to pollution, therefore impacting our environment.
Weed is grown either indoors or outdoors. Each have their own and shared requirements and impacts.
Indoor and outdoor growing both contribute to pollution, energy use, and water consumption.
The electricity is used to power the high-intensity lights, dehumidifiers, and heating and ventilation systems, such as the exhaust fans and air inlets mentioned earlier.
The high-intensity lighting that indoor growing requires is a huge source of energy use. In the United States, bills rack up to $6 billion yearly. To get a better idea of how much energy it requires, imagine a standard reading light and times that by 500.
Indoor growing uses 1% of the electricity used in the U.S. yearly, which is the same amount of electricity used by every computer in the country annually.
Furthermore, indoor growing requires 8 times more energy per square foot than a standard commercial building.
Keep in mind that legal and illegal growing impacts vary.
The water footprint of cannabis is another factor of the environmental impact.
Most indoor growers use filtered water to ensure a balanced pH level, which reveals the mechanics required to create filtered water in comparison to unfiltered water systems. Water usage also depends on the amount and size of plants.
Marijuana plants grown outdoor require several gallons of water a day to grow. In the summer, they require about 6 gallons of water per day per plant, in relation to a dishwasher which only uses 4 gallons of water to run. Furthermore, one joint requires approximately 0.25 gallons of water in comparison to a slice of pizza which requires about 40 gallons.
Researchers compared the agricultural impacts of harvest and cannabis and found that both were harmful to watersheds.
Marijuana facilities have also been known for using illegal sources of water to irrigate. These diversions contribute to reduced water flow of waterways, therefore impacting fisheries.
Another factor impacting fisheries is the runoff of pesticides and rodenticides used on cannabis crops. These chemicals pollute the rivers and threaten the aquatic system and surrounding ecosystems.
The Pacific fisher is an example of a species that was threatened by poisons from grow sites in the Sierra Nevada area. 85% of these species near the cannabis site were exposed to these harmful chemicals. The Pacific fisher makes up 10% of the total species affected and killed due to the poison.
Although outdoor cultivation doesn't require the energy that indoor production does, it poses a bigger threat to the land through irrigation and use of pesticides.
Researchers used 3 steps to identify the different land impacts of harvest and cannabis areas within California.
The first step was to analyze the forest changes, how the size and appearance of them have changed from 2000 to 2013.
The second step was to determine which areas were used for cannabis and which were used for the other harvests.
The last step was to identify which areas were impacted by agriculture versus areas impacted by natural disasters, in order to focus on agricultural productive areas.
Researchers discovered that over half the forest loss was due to harvest and 1% due to cannabis, which is due to the fact that there were more harvest areas than cannabis.
However, when considering comparisons per unit area, harvest areas were found to have caused more patches and landscape division,
whereas cannabis was more destructive in terms of loss of core area and increased fragmentation.
Indoor cannabis cultivation is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions due to the energy required to grow and maintain it. Illegal growing contributes to more pollution due to the use of generators, which accounts for more energy use.
Legal growers tend to tap into the grid, which 2/3 of it is powered by fossil fuels such as coal. Using coal to power electricity produces greenhouse gases.
To produce 1 pound of pot, it is about 2,095 pounds of coal burned, which is equivalent to 3 cross-country trips in a 44 mpg hybrid car, which emits about 1.95 metric tons of CO2.
Resulting in 15 metric tons of carbon emissions produced yearly. This is equivalent to the amount of carbon that approximately 3 million American cars produce. Additionally, the smoke that is released from one joint accounts for 2 pounds of CO2 emissions.
To minimize environmental impacts, there must be increased regulations on water supply, use of pesticides and rodenticides, energy use, and waste management. Although pesticide runoff can be prevented by moving cannabis cultivation indoors, the impacts of energy and emissions as a result of indoor cultivation doesn't counteract it.
To minimize water usage, growers should be legally growing their weed and be educated on the minimal amounts of water cannabis requires to grow.
For non-medical users that are using weed for health reasons, one way to reduce their use is to get advice from a medical professional regarding the amounts required to offset anxiety, for example.
If an individual's use decreases, then the demand for production goes down, creating less incentive for new cannabis facilities to form.
Although the information provided won't prohibit users from using, being aware of the health and environmental impacts may influence their frequency of use.
It's just like pizza. No one's going to stop eating pizza because of its unhealthy qualities and environmental impacts, but knowing the process could alter how often you choose to eat it.
Now that we know what weed is and how it's made, we can better understand how it impacts our health and the environmental impacts of it.
Weed is a psychoactive drug produced by a cannabis plant with chemicals such as delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol.
Cannabis requires intense lighting, ventilation, nutrients, and up to 6 gallons of water daily to grow.
Cannabis use is linked with a variety of mental and physical health benefits as well as a variety of issues.
Cannabis is found to reduce anxiety and provide a relaxed, euphoric feeling. However, has been linked to changes in the brain structure, memory, executive functioning, as well as increasing the risk of cardiovascular and respiratory issues.
Just as cannabis poses a threat to our health, it threatens the health of our environment as well.
Indoor cannabis production requires electricity, energy, and water. Outdoor cannabis production requires land and water. Both means of production contribute to high emissions and pollution.
Although we can't eliminate the impacts of weed cultivation, theoretically speaking, we can help reduce the environmental impacts.
We can do this by simply creating awareness through knowledge of weed and its processes.
That being said, we hope this presentation was helpful and informational, and if you use, think first and use responsibly.